This morning in Rome, Pope Leo canonized two young men as our two newest saints in the church calendar. One of them, Pier Giorgio Frassati, was a young man who died 100 years ago in 1925. He was very active in Italy in the Catholic workers' movement, and especially in fighting against Mussolini and fascism. But the other one that's been getting all of the attention is the one whose picture you see here in front of the altar, St. Carlo Acutis. And Carlo has been getting a lot more attention because, first of all, he's a saint from our own time. He was a millennial and one of our own people that we could have met. In fact, I remember in reading his biography at one point that he was at World Youth Day in Cologne, Germany. And I said, I was at World Youth Day in Cologne, Germany. I could have bumped into a future saint and not even known it. So he's a saint from our own times with an amazing story. And if you're not familiar with Carlo Acutis, let me give you a little brief summary of his life. He was born on May 3rd, 1991, which makes him a millennial, and in fact the first millennial to be canonized. And he was born to two Italian parents who were on business in London at the time, so they had him baptized there. And when he was a few months old, they returned home to their native Milan. But while they had him baptized, they were not practicing the faith, his parents. And so the boy did not have any chance to get any religious education. But as he grew, in fact, even just as a toddler, it was obvious that Jesus was speaking to him in his heart, that the Lord had made a very special presence known to this boy. Because as even a toddler, whenever they would go down the streets in Milan, whenever he would pass a church, he'd say, "Oh, Mommy, Daddy, I have to go in church and say hello to Jesus." And this would happen, he would insist upon it. And he went in and go right up to the Blessed Sacrament and spend a lot of time in prayer before him. And this happened over and over again, sometimes even bringing flowers to bring to the Blessed Mother and laying them at her feet. And other people began to see this young boy and point him out to their parents and say, there's something special about your child. And his mother says that he actually embarrassed them into having to relearn their faith because they said they really didn't know much about their Catholic faith, and they went back for lessons, for catechism, to learn about the faith. And eventually they too started coming back to church. And he had a manservant who was from India, who was a Hindu. And Carlo would just talk about, as he grew older, talk about his faith with him. And he convinced this young man to be baptized, and he became a Catholic. And he had that effect upon people. He was just a boy that people realized from an early age had a direct connection with Jesus. And there was something about this boy. But everybody noticed about him that he was a perfectly normal boy like others. He wasn't overly sanctimonious or an over-exaggerated piety about him or anything. In fact, they say he was a normal boy just like any other who just seemed to love the Lord. And he did so many of the things that other kids do. He loved pets and loved animals, which gave him a special love for St. Francis of Assisi, which ultimately led him to ask to be buried in Assisi, which is where he's buried today. And he taught himself the saxophone. In fact, he was brilliant. His mother says that he spoke his first words at only 3 months old, and by 5 months old was speaking short sentences. So he obviously was also very intelligent. Fun-loving kid. In fact, he even sometimes used to get in trouble in school for cutting up a little bit in class, so there's hope for some of us here today. And he also played soccer. He loved playing soccer with his friends, as most European young boys do. And he also had a great love for video games, especially Pokemon, which was his favorite. But he even gave himself limits as to how much time in a week he would allow himself to play it so that he did not become addicted to it. But other than that, he went to Mass every morning, confession every weekend, was not afraid to talk about his faith, but didn't in-your-face people with it. He was a lovable young man who was fun-loving, and they say great to be around. And the other thing he had about himself that he loved, he had a love for computers. And from an early age, he was fascinated by the science. And his mother says when he was only 8 years old, she had to buy him college-level computer programming books that he used, and taught himself how to write computer programs at only 8 and 10 years old. And eventually, he used that knowledge that he had to put together a website that is still active today. His followers have kept it going, where he documented every known Eucharistic miracle in the history of the church, from Lanciano in 700 AD, which is the first known Eucharistic miracle, even to ones of our modern times in the 80s and 90s. And his followers are examining Eucharistic miracles that have taken place since his death. And in many of those, it's absolutely fascinating. Not only is the work beautiful, in fact, last year, during our 125th anniversary celebration, one of the things we did was we had an exhibit of the Eucharistic miracle panels that Carlo Acutis had put together. And many people saw them up in our parish center and were inspired by what they saw. And with that, if you have any friends or anybody who denies the real presence of Jesus in the Eucharist, tell them to go to Carlo Acutis' site and to read about all the things that he documented for us. Starting, as I mentioned, with Lanciano, the first known one, there was a priest in 700 AD who was denying that Jesus was truly present in the Eucharist. And one day, while he was celebrating Mass, as he raised the host in consecration, the host turned into physical human flesh, and the cup of wine turned into physical human blood. And they preserved it. And it's kept to this day in the Church of Lanciano in Italy. You can see it. It's available for anyone to see any day. And some years back, some scientists got permission to do experiments on it, and they were absolutely amazed. First of all, this has been sitting in a monstrance in this church for 1,300 years. And yet, when they took the examples of it, they, looking at it under the microscope, they said, this heart is still, first of all, it's a human heart, and it's actually still living and beating. And the blood that they liquefied, they were able to type and found it was the type AB positive blood, which is the same type of blood found in the Shroud of Turin and the Sudarium of Oviedo, which is kept in Spain, which is reportedly the napkin that they put over Jesus' face when he died on the cross. So the blood types are all matching up there. And then two of our own time worth looking at. Buenos Aires, which Pope Francis, as a cardinal, as the archbishop there, was involved with, where a host began to exude a blood-like substance, and they preserved that. Another one in Tixla in Mexico. And in both of these, they sent samples of them to some of the finest forensic pathologists in the world. One of them right here to New York, to Frederick Zugaby, who was the county coroner in Rockland County and was a prominent teacher at Columbia University. And when they looked at these samples under the microscope, without telling them where they came from, Zugaby especially turned to somebody and said, how is it possible that you've sent me a piece of a human heart that is still beating? He says, it's part of the left ventricle wall. He says, and not only is it still beating, but the white blood cells are still attacking pathogens. How have you possibly sent me a piece of a continuously beating human heart? Defies any modern explanation. And this is right in our own time. And so anybody who denies the real presence of the Eucharist in Jesus, just tell them to see those pages that Carlo put together for us. Well, Carlo had done this whole beautiful presentation, and he was 15 years old by the time it was done, and he was all prepared to have this grand presentation in this big exposition, if you will. And shortly before it was ready to go, he ended up taking ill. It was October, early October in the year 2006. And at first his parents thought he had the flu, but when they took him to the doctor immediately rushed him to the hospital, and they ran tests and discovered he had a very rare type of leukemia that only showed symptoms in its final stages and was absolutely uncurable. And they knew he wouldn't last much longer. And indeed, they took him in early October, and he died on October 12th in 2006 at only 15 years old. But in his time there in the hospital, he comforted the people around him. His mother, obviously you can imagine how grieving a mother would be knowing she's about to lose her 15-year-old son. But he said to her, he says, Mom, I know I'm not going to leave this hospital alive, but I know I will go to heaven because I have never spent a moment of my life doing anything that is displeasing to the Lord, and I will send you signs from heaven. And one he did, she says that he came to her in a vision and told her he would be a canonized saint one day, which happened today. And also, she gave birth. He had been the only child. But on the anniversary of his death, a few years later, she gave birth to twin boys. And she took that immediately, of course, as a sign that he was with the Lord in heaven. And when people came in asking him how he felt, was he in pain? He says, there are a lot of people who are in a lot more pain than I am. And he offered his sufferings for the Pope, who was Benedict XVI at the time, and for the church. And during his life, he had several pithy little statements that people have remembered, many of them, but three that have caught the attention more than others. One that I put on the poster here, which incidentally I used downstairs when Hurricane Irene came through a few years ago. You may remember that it completely flooded our basement here in the church, and we had to gut it and start all over. And I decided to use the opportunity to turn it into a youth center and named it the Carlo Acutis Youth Center. And this picture is the picture that I put down there in the youth center. And I put probably his most famous quote on there. Somebody asked him what he planned to do with his life, and he said, "To live always close to Jesus, that is my life plan." Another that people remember is that he said, "The Eucharist is my highway to heaven." And a third one that's often quoted is he said, "Many people begin life as individuals but end as photocopies," referring to the fact how so many people model themselves on celebrities that they try to be just like that person and imitate them, that they forget the unique dignity that is theirs, that God has given them. Now, when he died, and of course a 15-year-old, when there's a funeral, of course you expect it to be sad. And when a 15-year-old dies, usually people want to do something in his memory, maybe a scholarship fund or some other project or something like that. But one thing they don't normally do is call the bishop and say, this man should be canonized a saint. But that's what they did with Carlo. His mother even says at his funeral, even in the midst of the sadness, there was a very different spirit in the air, almost of hope, because people realized that a saint had lived among them and that his presence there was not in vain. In fact, there were two different people who reported miracles at his funeral, praying, asking Carlo Acutis to intercede for them, and that miracles took place just as they were praying at his funeral. Well, you have to be dead dead for 5 years, according to church law, for your cause of canonization to begin. So right away in 2011, when he was dead 5 years, they immediately advanced his cause, and it went rather quickly. And two miracles were ascribed to his intervention. The first one that led him to be blessed, to be beatified and called Blessed Carlo Acutis, was a young boy in Brazil who was dying of a horrible pancreatic disease. And the boy's mother wrote to Carlo's mother and told him about it. And Carlo's mother sent one of his T-shirts to the boy. And she says as soon as she took Carlo's T-shirt and touched the son with it, he was miraculously healed. The second one that led to his canonization took place in 2021, in July, where a college student from Costa Rica was studying in Florence, Italy, and she was out biking one day, and she fell off her bicycle and hit her head. And she had serious head injuries from it. They rushed her to the hospital, but they said there was so much water on the brain, so much interior damage, that they gave her no hope of recovery. Well, her parents, who had rushed, of course, from Costa Rica to Italy to be with their daughter, the mother decided at that point to go to Assisi, where Carlo is buried, and pray before his tomb, asking Carlo to intercede and heal her daughter. And miraculously, the daughter was healed. She made a complete recovery. And when the doctors compared the time when she started showing recovery, they realized it was precisely at the moment that the mother was praying at Carlo's tomb in Assisi. And so Pope Francis approved it as the second miracle to advance him to canonization. And he set his canonization to take place this past year on April 27th. And everything was all set to go. In fact, you're going to receive some gifts at the end of Mass that the greeters will give you. There's a little packet, a little thing for children, and a prayer card for adults. And in the bulletin, there's a flyer about him. But you'll notice in there that one of the things mentions that he was canonized on April 27th, 2025. Well, I had all of those in my office and all ready to go, and then Pope Francis passed away. And of course, April 27th was during the interregnum before a new pope was elected, and so we had to wait for a new pope to come in and set a new date. So Pope Leo then did come along and set today as the day that he and Giorgio Frassati would be canonized. So if you see in the thing he was canonized on April 25th or April 27th, 2025, I didn't feel like going with a pen and crossing that out and writing September 7th on each one. So you know why the date is off on that. But his canonization, which has taken the world by storm, and in fact, it's the first time in history that someone has been canonized and both their parents were present for it. When Maria Goretti died, her mother was still alive, and she was present for her daughter's canonization, but the father had passed away. But today in Rome, both Carlo's mother and father were there, watching their son be canonized. And I can only imagine what it was like for his parents to see that. But Carlo's canonization at this time in history, I think, is not an accident, because the Lord is coinciding it perfectly with something that's going on in our young people today. Every study recently is showing that there is an uptick in young people attending Mass in church all over the place, but especially Catholics. And young people are starting to see once again the need for formal worship, the need to come and be with the community, that just I can pray by myself is not enough, that we need to be present to help one another. And especially, sometimes people say, I don't need to go to church, I can pray on my own. Well, yes, we can pray on our own. But one thing we can't do is receive the Eucharist on our own. We need to come to church for that. And young people are starting to see that and come back to the faith. And when they ask them why, they're saying it's because, and some of them are coming from other denominations of Christianity, especially even some of those mega churches, the TV evangelists that put on those massive shows every weekend. And some of them are leaving that and coming to us because they say, at the Catholic Mass, I feel like I have truly worshiped God. Whereas at those other places, they feel like they've been entertained by a big show. They want worship. And even some of the young people are actually looking to the Latin Mass. They want a sense of devotion and true adoration and worship of God. Of course, I don't think we have to go as far as the Latin Mass for that, but certainly celebrating the Mass with greater devotion. The young people are telling us that's what they want, and I promise you that's what we'll do here and continue to do here at St. Denis, is offer the devotion of the Mass with the greatest devotion our hearts can offer, and most especially accentuating the real presence of Jesus in the Eucharist, which Carlo Acutis spent so much of his life talking about, the important gift there of Jesus truly present in the Eucharist. I have been convinced for some time, and all the more now, with Carlo Acutis' canonization, that the way to get people back in Mass on Sunday is to get them to appreciate what we celebrate here in the Eucharist, that bread and wine become the actual body and blood of Jesus, and which we take, and it brings us into union with him so that we are with Christ on the cross, suffering with him, dying with him, and rising again with our sins being forgiven over and over again every time we receive the Lord Jesus in the Eucharist. And I've always felt that if people truly understood the gift of the Eucharist, they'd be breaking down the doors of the church every Sunday to get in, and we wouldn't be able to build churches big enough to hold all the people that want to come and be part of Jesus in the Eucharist. And so, my brothers and sisters, as the young people have shown us the way, that this is what they're looking for, and Carlo Acutis, a 15-year-old boy who was canonized today, who spent much of his life talking about the Eucharist, the time is ripe for us. And I think it's a wonderful time for us to be Catholics, especially with our belief in the real presence of Jesus in the Eucharist, that we can do all the more we can to reach out to everyone, to help them realize Jesus is truly here. He's truly present in the Eucharist. Come and adore him whenever the church is open. Come to exposition on First Friday when we have it. And realize the beautiful gift that a little toddler knew in Italy when he used to go and say, I have to spend time before Jesus, that we can come and do the same thing. And if we can do that, then we will renew the church in the face of the earth and the whole earth as well, by reminding people of the beautiful gift of Jesus in the Eucharist that was so beautifully reminded to us by St. Carlo Acutis. May Jesus Christ be praised, now and forever.